Good afternoon. Today we'll be talking to you about why GMOs should be labeled, and I'm Gwen Kozak.
I'm Macy Blosser.
I'm Maggie Meyer.
And I'm Kate Hansen.
So, what are GMOs? GMO stands for genetically modified organisms. GMOs are living beings that have had their genetic code changed in some way. There's many types of GMO processes. One is crossbreeding. Crossbreeding is when you take two compatible crops and cross-pollinate them to produce a hybrid. For example, a plum and apricot. The next is mutagenesis. Mutagenesis is inducing genetic changes through radiation or chemicals. Protoplast fusion is when you take two plant cells which have their hard cell walls removed and you add a chemical called polyethylene. Polyploidy is introduced by soaking seeds in a chemical that can either make sterile crosses fertile, such as a hybrid of wheat and rye, or sterilizes crops, like watermelon, to make a seedless strain. Genome editing. This process has the ability to cut, replace, or insert genes within a seed cells using molecular scissors. Transgenesis is when genes from one crop are incorporated into another.
Currently, 64 countries have laws governing the labeling of GMO products. The United States should be no exception to that. Consumers have a right to know what they are putting into their bodies. Cigarettes, alcohol, products that contain allergens, and makeup are all required to carry some form of labeling to warn consumers about some aspect of the product. One solution that has been proposed for the GMO labeling conflict is the BE labeling law going into practice in 2020. BE stands for bioengineered foods. However, this does not cover all GMO processes. It does not label all GMO products, as some legislators have commented, and it does not require foods with two or less BE ingredients to be labeled. So for example, if you're shopping for a boxed product and it only contains two or less BE ingredients, they don't have to label that.
In this chart, we are looking at opinions on labeling GMOs in the United States. This chart shows us the variation across 4 regions, which include the Northwest, Southwest, South, and West regions of the United States. As you can see, a majority of the population is in favoring of labeling GMOs. It is very interesting to see that majority of the people across the region are in favor of labeling, but it's also interesting that the portion of the population that don't know or are against labeling GMOs have similar outcomes too.
Many illnesses are becoming more common today, and this does not seem to be a coincidence. Research has found that pesticides and toxins in GMO food may still remain in the body after consumption. According to research compiled by the Institute for Responsible Technology, most GMOs are Roundup ready. The active ingredient in Roundup is classified as a Class 2A carcinogen by the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Our next graph is going to explore the relationship between GMOs and autism. Glyphosate is contained in Roundup, a pesticide sprayed on GMO fields.
In this chart, we are looking at the trends of the number of children with autism and the number of GMO corn crops planted. The gray line represents children with autism, while the green line represents the percentage of GMO crops planted. It is easy to see the trend that as the number of GMO crops planted increases, so does the number of children with autism. It is important to remember that correlation does not equal causation. However, with the strength of the correlation, this should raise a big red flag.
So now we'll talk about the consumer feelings and rights. In the next graph, we will be supporting some of these facts that we're going to talk about. So approximately 90% of the U.S. consumers support GMO labeling in the U.S. Consumer incomes are rising, suggesting that the need for cheap GMO products is not as great. There are also protests every year for GMO labeling laws. As you can see in the image below, there's quite a few people and there's more and more protesting going on every day with more information on GMOs that are coming out. Next, the Consumer Bill of Rights is also a giant factor in all of this because the Consumer Bill of Rights has 8 basic consumer rights. 2 of those are the right to be informed and the right to choose. So, asking for labeling on GMOs is simply asking for consumer rights to be upheld. In this chart, we are looking at the trends of cases of allergies being reported and the number of GMO corn crops being planted. The green line represents the number of GMO crops being planted, while the green bars represent the population of people with allergies. It is easy to see the trend as the number of GMO crops planted increases, so does the number of people with allergies. With the strength of this correlation, it should be a warning that the GMO corn being planted could be causing major influences on food allergies.
Currently, there are also many environmental concerns surrounding GMO products. Just as the toxins and chemicals from GMOs can stay in the human body, they can also leak into the soil, which introduces chemicals and toxins to other crops and water systems. Cross-contamination typically occurs when pollen from a farmer's genetically modified crops is carried over to neighboring non-GMO fields. This is an increasing problem, as organic fields can actually be fined if they have any non-GMO products found to have grown in their fields. One way that GMOs seek to reduce pesticide use is by changing and modifying genes in food to make them resistant to certain insects. However, insects such as the western corn rootworm have evolved resistance to one of the genes that has been deployed against them. This is causing farmers to rely on pesticides, and in some cases they are using more pesticides that were used in the past. There are currently many more health-related and environmental studies being done on GMO products to determine their risks. GMOs are still a relatively new way of growing food, and naturally many people are concerned about the technique. We are years, perhaps even decades away from truly understanding what GMOs do to our bodies. In a society where we are starting to learn the consequences of bad eating habits, it is crucial to be informed about every product that we put into our bodies.
The purpose of this chart is to emphasize the impact that GMO crops are having on the environment. Specifically, we are looking at the impact that GMO crops are having on the butterfly population. The gray bars represent the butterfly population over time, even before GMO crops were making up less than 1% of crops, while the green bars represent the growth of GMO crops over time. As you can see, before GMO crops were introduced, the butterfly population was at its highest. Although their population varied, it was still significantly higher than before GMO crops were introduced. Since GMO crops were introduced, the butterfly population has steadily decreased, with the exception of 2015. This is only one of many examples of how GMO crops are impacting our environment.
So throughout this presentation, we have been arguing that consumers have a right to labeling and that GMOs should be labeled. Without proper labeling, we are violating 2 of the 8 rights in the Consumer Bill of Rights. All GMO products and ingredients should be labeled to increase the clarity given to consumers.
We live in a world full of choices. We live in a society where people want to know all their options and have the right to choose their own path. It should be no different when it comes to our food. We would not shop at a grocery store where our products were chosen for us, so why would we have to purchase food that is not labeled properly? Even with the BE labeling law going into practice in 2020, consumers will still not have all the information they should have.
So we brought in one of our classmates to sit in on our presentation to see if we could convince her. So did we convince you, Kate?
So after hearing your guys' arguments, I think that you did convince me. I think it's fair for all food products to be labeled by GMOs. The chart that was most convincing to me was the GMO and autism chart. I think you guys showed a great, strong correlation between the two, and it's very concerning that consumers are unaware of what they're putting in their bodies.
Yeah, that's interesting. The GMO and autism chart was actually one that I found incredibly interesting, but one of my favorites was the bar chart where we showed the U.S. opinion on GMO labeling. I found this to be the most influential in my opinion because it showed a great contrast between those who favored and those who opposed, and it showed that there was a larger amount that favored versus the very small amount that seems to oppose.
And it was also interesting how many people are unaware of what GMOs even are, and that's going with Kate's point. That's pretty scary that you're putting all these things in your body and you don't even know. Another one that was really influential to me was the image that we found from a protest, protesting the labeling of GMO foods, but they're protesting for it. As you can see in just that one picture, there were so many people, so many signs, because it is important. We are consuming these products every single day and we don't even know what they're doing to us or for us.
Yeah, I find that incredibly interesting, especially since they're going to be doing so many more studies in the next 10 to 20 years, still trying to figure out exactly what GMOs do to our bodies, because we really don't have a full picture yet. And I think that's even more important when you're considering labeling, because if you don't really know what something's going to do to your body, you should know that you're consuming that type of product.
So thank you so much, Kate, for coming in today and listening to what we have to say.
I hope we convinced you too.